Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Bags packed? Check. Cab ride to the airport booked? Check. Headphones to watch the in-flight movie? Check. Is there anything we're missing? Wait, did we pay those new fees to actually have a carry-on bag and just sit in the seats we want? That's a conversation many of us may be having in the new year, as Air Canada joins some of its competitors to start charging you more for different elements of jumping on a flight. The airline has announced beginning January 3rd, if you buy their basic fare option, you're going to have to pay $35 just to bring a carry-on bag, and an extra $50 if you take a second. Later in January, they'll also start charging for seat selection. Transport Minister Anita Anand is disappointed and concerned about the impact this may have on passengers.
Whether we're talking about students or seniors or families, they're saving for traveling. And I think it is incumbent upon the airlines to recognize that the decisions that they make, and certainly that decision by Air Canada, is going to affect the people who can least afford these measures.
Air Canada tells me in a statement that this is a commercial decision and notes their competitors already have similar policies in place. The minister is planning to meet with airline CEOs before the holidays to discuss this fare issue and affordability, but at this time it's not really clear if she's planning on taking any specific actions. So what is behind this fare decision? What can the federal government do about it to make air travel more affordable? And is it time to beef up competition in the airline sector? I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney. Today on The Big Story, I'm discussing those topics with John Gradek, a lecturer at McGill University who teaches aviation management. So John, thanks very much for joining me.
No problem. It's been a pleasure.
What do you think is behind this decision by Air Canada?
Oh, it's really... Air Canada says it's a competitive move, which is interesting. Typically, when you see a competitive move, it's a competitive move pricing it downward to meet a competitive price offering. This time, it's upwards, where they're now charging passengers for a process that was included in the previous tickets. You know, there was never a charge for carry-on. And now, because WestJet and Porter charge for these carry-ons, Air Canada said, well, we might as well join the fray as well and look at incrementing revenues as a result of this additional charge. And surprisingly, Flair is not charging for these carry-on bags. So it's an interesting move on the part of Air Canada. And I think it's also part of the fact that Air Canada's got some issues with respect to passengers bringing too much carry-on baggage on the airplane, chewing up overhead bin space.
Since you don't see this as a competitive move, do you see this as a cash grab by the airline?
Most definitely a cash grab. There's very little additional cost that Air Canada is going to incur as a result of these fees. It's just check baggage, initial piece of check baggage. So there's not going to be a significant amount of cost associated with this charge to the passenger. So it's going to be pretty well going to the bottom line pretty quickly. And so I figure somewhere between $10 and $20 million of additional revenues, profits annually for Air Canada on this feature.
As you noted, WestJet does have its ultra basic ticket tier that does charge for carry-on bag and seat selection and things like that. And a couple of other airlines do something similar. Do you see Air Canada doing the exact same as those, or are there differences between what the airlines are offering here between Air Canada, WestJet, Porter, Flair, etc.?
Air Canada is being a copycat. They're basically being a copycat. They've added a couple of interesting features to it, which is a second charge for carry-on bags. If you have your second carry-on bag, it's $50. And if you happen to show up at the gate, somehow, some way, you got to the gate with a carry-on bag, they're going to ding you $65. So this is all about additional revenues that Air Canada can get from passengers. And they'll have Air Canada people eyeballing carry-on baggage quite closely and making sure that you, in fact, do pay those fees associated with carry-on baggage.
So let's look at the airline industry as a whole and where it stands today. During the pandemic, they were one of many industries that were suffering. due to mandates and restrictions. Are they still suffering, and this is maybe a way for them to raise revenue to get back to normal? Or are they better off today, and there might be less of a defense for add-on charges like this?
Well, I think that what's happened with the pandemic, you're right. The industry got clobbered pretty hard. Lost billions of dollars. We as taxpayers subsidized a number of lifelines that were sent to the industry. In fact, the Canadian government, you and I, invested $500 million into Air Canada, which is part of the equity structure of Air Canada, and it's still there. But I think what we see happening now is that the airline industry has come back to its pre-pandemic levels. But let's face it, the industry doesn't make a lot of money. The industry makes about margins of about 2.5% to 3% a year, which is not a lot of money, which is around the same ballpark as what the grocery stores typically get. But they're trying to improve their bottom line, and they're trying to get more return to their shareholders. And whatever rabbit hole they can go down to increase that revenue base and that profit base, they will go down. So, ultra basic fares by WestJet was their attempt to kind of mirror what some of the U.S. carriers were doing, like JetBlue and Frontier, Spirit, Allegiant, all charged for that carry-on bag. So that's where WestJet got its idea for the ultra basic fare with a carry-on baggage charge. Porter jumped on that one as well for their lowest fare, and now Air Canada's jumped on the bandwagon as well.
Was it already their lowest fare and they just added these charges, or did they offer an even lower fare? Because you look at European airlines and you do see things like Ryanair, let's say, as an example, where they offer really low ticket prices, but then nickel and dime for every little add-on. But you could choose to go with very little on your trip and therefore save a lot of money over in Europe. Is that what we're seeing here in Canada, or are they just taking their lowest fare that was already there anyway and just adding these charges on top?
Well, that's what our friends at WestJet did. WestJet introduced the ultra basic fare. Not much of a difference from their old basic fare, maybe a few bucks lower, but nothing to write home about. And Air Canada did not. When Air Canada makes this announcement, Air Canada said, well, the old fare that we had, that was our cheapest fare, the standard fare, the basic fare that Air Canada calls basic. Basically, just that now there's going to be an additional charge for baggage on that fare. So they didn't reduce the fare to reflect any changes in pricing. They just basically added an additional fee for people bringing carry-on bags for that ticket price.
More on the big story with McGill University aviation management lecturer John Gradek talking about Air Canada's new fees for carry-on bags and seat selection in just a moment. John, let's turn the conversation to what can be done about this. The transport minister says she's disappointed in this decision, and she wants to talk to airline CEOs about affordability issues. And the airline industry is under federal regulation. So what can the government do here?
Well, I think Anita's got, it's nice to hear Anita make her statement. I think that, we've been waiting to hear how Anita's going to be dealing with aviation in Canada over the last few months. She's been appointed as Minister of Transport. This is her first, major public foray into the world of aviation. So I'd like to thank her for that. But I think that, the Air Canada basically made a statement that says, it doesn't really matter what Anand says. I think that, we did this for competitive reasons. And, if the minister was worried about these fares, they should have gone after WestJet or Porter, in the last few months, because they've had this ticketing and additional collection practice in place. And now that Air Canada has done it, now it's raising the ire of the minister. So, I'm not sure exactly how Air Canada is going to deal with this. Typically when you ask for a competitive response, and the airlines use competitive response, it's really to match a reduction in prices. This is a competitive response to match an increase in fees. And I think the minister is getting a little worried that the way customer service is being provided by the airlines in Canada and all of these ancillary fees, the U.S. call them junk fees, all of these fees basically are causing passengers a lot of confusion in terms of what are they entitled to and what do they have to charge. And I think that level of confusion, because this is a federally regulated industry, the minister can, in fact, introduce regulations and legislation to basically look at oversight of commercial activities. if she is really concerned about the level of service that Canadians are getting from their tickets they're buying on Canadian carriers, she has the power basically provide that commercial oversight and to make decisions about the applicability and the introduction of these charges that the airlines are doing in a federally regulated industry. So she does have power.
So what would that oversight sort of look like? I mean, could they force the airlines to lower prices to include things like carry-ons in an overall fee? Would it really result in the end for lower prices for air travelers, many of whom are finding it hard to deal with the expenses of just jumping on a plane, even flying down to Toronto last minute? You're going to be between Ottawa and Toronto, you're going to be paying around $1,000 at the very least.
Yeah, and I think that's what the minister is basically, drawing a line in the sand on this one, saying that, customer service and the service that customers get for a given ticket, there has to be a minimum level of service, a certain standard into which you cannot nickel and dime stuff away from passengers. So I think I'm not putting words in her mouth, but what I would consider a minimum level of service would be, carry-on bags, no charge, check baggage, no charge for seat selection, and to basically make sure that the bundle that's being sold to the passenger by a carrier for the cheapest ticket has got a bundle set of services that today are considered additional collections, ancillary revenues and charges, junk fees, and say those are no longer junk fees. They're no longer optional. They are mandatory. And if you're going to sell an airline ticket in Canada, those services and those activities basically are part of the base fare. So thank you very much for these junk fees, no longer applicable.
But could the airlines just then turn around and raise those basic fares to offset that, and therefore Canadians will get their carry-on but are still paying more regardless?
Yeah, I'd like to see the airlines try that. I think that, we've got enough airlines in Canada, between the four of them that are out there, the three others other than Air Canada, there's enough competitive juices flowing in their veins to basically, make sure that, they are able to, in fact, get away with, a mandated set of services, and yet remain very, price competitive. So, yeah, this will be a pain. It'll be a hit on their revenues, of course, because in these additional collections, like Flair has basically said that 40% of their annual revenues come from these ancillary charges. And so, would this, be an issue for Flair? Yeah, probably. But I think that Flair and WestJet and Porter are highly competitive carriers that, they can live with this mandate of bundling everything into a price. We'll start playing the price game and only the price game because the services are not going to be differentiated.
There are critics who have been demanding more changes in the airline sector to try and increase competition even further, possibly attract other airlines to our market. How simple or easy is it to increase competition in the airline industry, which has large startup costs? Obviously, buying planes is not cheap. How reasonable is that? How realistic is that to see another competitor enter the market possibly?
Well, the airline industry is a strange industry. The people have been getting into the airline industry for decades in the hope of making millions, if not billions. And there is no shortage of entrepreneurs in Canada who think they have a better mousetrap when it comes to airline travel and airline competition. So I don't think we have a shortage of entrepreneurs in Canada wanting to get into the industry. They have to be well-heeled. You're right. Costs you $100 million to start an airline. And so it's not for the faint of heart. But I think that, the Competition Bureau is looking at competition among the Canadian airlines as we speak. And they will be putting together recommendations and a report, hopefully by mid-year of 2025, about what are the changes we're going to have to do in the regulatory environment and the commercial environment to increase competition in the industry. So your point is well taken. The industry is under the microscope by the federal government. There are a number of initiatives being considered. Do we let foreign carriers operate into Canada domestically? Interesting concept. Requires some work, but that might be something we might want to do. How do we, protect and keep the upstart carriers, the low-cost carriers? How do we protect them from competitive moves by Air Canada and by WestJet to try to get rid of them? We've seen how that process works over the last 30 years. We've lost 20 airlines over the last 30 years who were positioning themselves as low cost. And guess what? They're gone. Why? Competitive moves, down matching prices. And so the question is, how do we structure an industry where we allow these carriers to survive and flourish, yet keep the big guys away from trying to get them out of business?
And it's funny because it's a similar conversation being had when it comes to grocery stores bringing in competition. It's not so simple when we talk about bringing in foreign companies. We saw Target in the retail sector came for a little bit and then decided, this isn't worth the cost and the market isn't big enough, so we're out of here. Do you see it similar in that situation?
We see, and we're seeing the same thing happen in telecom. And watch the Rogers guys getting the hot seat. But I think that we are a small market. Let's not compare ourselves to Europe as an entity, or to the U.S. 400 or 500 million people in a landmass smaller than Canada versus our 40 million. We have an order of magnitude issue in terms of how many frequencies, how many carriers, how many flights, how many airplanes can the Canadian market support. And I think there's a limit. And we saw the limits. We saw, last summer of 23, we had 6 carriers flying Toronto-Calgary. 6. And right now, so 2 of them are gone. Canada Jetlines is gone, and our friends at Lynx are gone. Now we're down to 4. We may be down to 3 soon. And the question then becomes, the market is, in fact, managing the size of the competition that's out there. And I think that there is, in my opinion, there's a lot of strength and there's a lot of market power being provided by Air Canada and WestJet. Between the two of them, 80% of the Canadian market is controlled by those 2 carriers. It's the same thing in groceries. And so you've got majors basically pushing smaller guys out. And I think that that's something we have to talk about in terms of, how do we promote and how do we grow an industry where we have these large organizations already competing.
All right, John, thank you so much for your thoughts on all of this. Really appreciate your insight.
All right, my pleasure. Have a great day. Take care.
That was John Gradek, who teaches aviation management at McGill University. We were talking about Air Canada's new baggage and seat selection fees, what it means for passengers, and what the federal government can do about it. Just a reminder about a new great listening experience for you. You can listen anytime to the Big Story podcast on Seeker. That's SEEKR. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney. Thanks for listening.